Hi guys, in this part of the video we're going to take a look at aperture and the effects that it has on your exposure. Also, just to drop a quick tip for you, aperture also has an effect on your depth of field, and we're going to look at that in a separate tutorial series coming up soon, so look out for that. So let's take a look at aperture. Okay, looking at aperture. Now, the aperture will vary in terms of the range of apertures that you have available to you based on what lens you have. Most people start with a kit lens, which is an 18 to 55, and that has a range from f3.5 to 5.6 as it goes through the zoom range, and then we'll stop down beyond that to f22, maybe even further to f36, something like that. So we'll go on to aperture. Now, currently I have a Canon 24-105 on my 5D2 here, and it's just set to f8. No reason, it was just already set to f8. And as we change the aperture value here, we can do it on either dial, we will see it'll start to walk through in 1/3 stop increments. So f8, 7.1, 6.3, and so forth. This is an f4 lens, so I cannot go any wider than f4. I can't get to 2.8. For example, I will need an f2.8 lens, and it will stop down all the way to f22 and won't go any further. Lenses which will go further than f22 typically are larger telephoto zooms like the 70 to 200s or macro lenses usually. Some lenses do have a limit of f16 as well, rather randomly. But there we go. As we scroll down, we can actually open up the aperture. Scroll through the way we close down the aperture. Now we're going to have a look at the effects of aperture on our exposure, and also don't forget that aperture also affects your depth of field. So f22, greater depth of field, then say f4 for example, and we'll come more into depth of field in a later tutorial video. Just want to drop that little nugget in as we're looking at the effects of aperture on exposure. So let's take a look. Okay, and we're back, and we are looking at aperture and the effects on exposure this time. Now, we are not going to be talking about flash exposure, because some of you may be aware by watching other videos that aperture controls flash exposure, although there's more to it than that. We're just looking at available light, constant light sources, lights in the room, the video lights we have here, the modeling light, the window light, natural light outside if we were outside, for example. So we've looked in previous videos at ISO, we've looked also at shutter speed and their effects on exposure. We're just going to concentrate solely on aperture for this video. Our ISO will be on 500 and our shutter speed will be at a 50th of a second, because that's a good exposure for the scene that we have here, the way that it's lit. Okay, now from the previous clip that played after the intro to this video, we saw on the back of my 5D, we went through the aperture range and how to change the aperture. How you go about doing that on your camera will vary a little bit. Also, just to recap, don't forget that each lens will have a different aperture range. Some lenses are variable aperture lenses, so they will go from f3.5 to 5.6 like the kit lenses, for example. So if you have your lens wide open at 3.5 at the widest 18 millimeters and then you zoom in, it's going to stop down and affect exposure in that way for you. Lenses will have a range typically from their widest working aperture, which could be f4, f3.5, f2.8 through to f22, and some specialist lenses may have a wider range and go to f32, f36 and even beyond. Usually that's large telephotos and macro lenses. So on the EOS M3 that I'm filming on now with the kit lens, which is the 15 to 45, it is a f3.5 to f6.3. Currently we're at 5.6. If I were to zoom the lens, it is going to stop down to 6.3. I've changed the scene and the framing because it is a variable aperture lens. So it's gone from 5.6. As soon as I've racked out to 45mm, it has gone now to 5.6. So we'll zoom out a little bit there. It's gone now to 5.6 again. Sorry, as you zoom in, it goes to 6.3. And we'll get it to focus. Come on, camera, focus, 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 focus. There we go. Now pop it to manual. Okay, so as we make a change to the aperture, we have an effect on exposure, and we also affect depth of field. f1.4, for example, will give you a shallower depth of field than f8, f16, f22 will. Depth of field we're going to come back to and go in more detail on because there's more elements than just aperture, but I don't want to kind of skim over that or not mentioning it at all because it is having an effect on your exposure but also your depth of field. So there's a creative choice based on how you're working, what depth of field do you want, and that's going to dictate what your aperture will be in many situations. But let's walk through the aperture range now, okay, and see where we can get. Now, with this lens being a variable aperture lens, I can't go any wider. Oh, I can. There we go. It's let me. At this focal length that I'm at the moment, I can go to f5, which makes the image brighter. I open that aperture up. Think of it as an iris. It opens up, lets more light through. Another way to describe aperture is a window. Small window lets less light through than a large bay window, for example. Okay, a small window would be f22, whereas a large bay window may be f2.8. So the lower the f-stop or the aperture value in number, f2.8, f1.4, 1.8, f2, the more light it lets in. The larger the aperture value, f22, f16, and such, the less light it lets in. So we've gone from 5.6 to f5, which is increased exposure 1/3 of a stop. I don't think it'll let me go any further. Nope, unless I zoom wide here. Let's go all the way and zoom out. We'll refocus. Come on, camera. There we go. Back to manual focus. Now I can open up the aperture even further. So we'll go to f4.5, f4, f3.5, and that's as wide as this lens will go. And as we see, as we open up that aperture, so we get that lower aperture number, we increase exposure. And again, we're working in 1/3 stop and 1 full stop increments. As we stop down, as it's referred to, or we close down the aperture, so we've gone from a wider hole now to a narrower hole, okay, we decrease the exposure. So we'll go from 3.5 to f4, 4.5, f5, 5.6, 6.3, 7.1, f8. Now f8 is a full stop increment. And as we can see, everything within that scene has got darker. So if I was now to stop down 1 stop, we'll go from f8, 1, 2, 3. So we go f8, f9, f10, f11 is the next stop. The scene has now got 1 stop darker, and we have halved the amount of light in the scene. We can see the mannequins darker, the modeling light's darker, and the window as well. If I wanted to take it further still and go 1 stop darker again, f13, f14, and then boom, 1 stop f16. And it's got much darker still. Now if I stop down all the way to f22, which is all this lens will do, that's as dark as we can make it. Now if we go the other way, we will start to increase exposure. So we're on a large f-stop number, a large aperture number here, f22. As we go to smaller numbers, f20, f18, these are 1/3 stop changes, f16, that's a full stop increment, f14, f13, f11, we can see the scene getting brighter. Now, you're not going to see the change in the depth of field too much in this video because we're making such a drastic change to the exposure, especially when the image is dark. You're possibly not going to see the change in the depth of field. We will come back to that in a later video. So let's continue opening up. F9, F8, F7.1, F6.3, F5.6, which is where we started. And we can continue to open up the aperture, increasing the exposure, giving us a shallower depth of field as well. F5, F4.5, F4, F3.5. And again, that's as wide as it will go. So you've seen as we make changes to our ISO, to our shutter speed with the previous videos, and now with the aperture, what effects that it has on the exposure. Remember, think of it, a smaller aperture number, so f3.5 or f2.8, what have you, think of it as a wider window, and then a larger f-stop number, a larger number value for the aperture, f16, f11. It's a much smaller window, so we decrease exposure, and we'll walk through again. So f4, f5, f4.5, f5 now, f5.6, 6.3, 7.1, f8. Okay, and then we'll open it back up and we increase the exposure. Go back to 5.6. So I hope that makes things a little easier to understand in terms of what effects the aperture has on your exposure. Again, we'll come back to the depth of field side of things. If you have any comments or questions, do pop them in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.